The morning sun reflected sharply off the glass towers of downtown Chicago as people rushed into the corporate building of Harrington & Co. with the usual urgency of money, deadlines, and ambition. Inside the lobby, polished floors mirrored the movement of expensive shoes, and the sound of phones, heels, and brief conversations filled the air like background noise that never stopped. Among all of that movement, one person stood still for a moment before stepping inside. Ethan Carter, a young, black intern, dressed in a simple but clean navy suit that looked slightly less expensive than everyone else's. He adjusted his ID badge as he walked through the revolving doors, keeping his expression calm, controlled. It was his first week here, and he had already learned something important. In this building, people noticed everything about you except your mind. The receptionist barely looked up when he arrived. Intern section is downstairs, she said, pointing without interest. Ethan nodded politely. Thank you. No smile, no acknowledgement, just another invisible person passing through. In the elevator, he stood in the corner while two executives in front of him talked loudly about stock options and bonuses. One of them glanced at Ethan in the reflection and then whispered something to the other. They both smirked. Ethan didn't respond. He had learned that silence was safer than reaction. On the 14th floor, interns were seated in a shared walkspace, laptops, notebooks, coffee cups, novice energy, everyone trying to prove they deserved to be there. Ethan took his seat quietly. Within minutes, he noticed it. He wasn't included in conversations, not intentionally loud exclusion, worse, invisible exclusion. When tasks were assigned, his name was skipped and then added last with the least important work. Just give him data entry or something, one employee said casually. Another laughed. Yeah, he'll be fine with that. Ethan heard every word, but he still said nothing. Because he had a reason for being here, and it wasn't what they thought. Days passed like that. Every morning, the same routine. Every interaction, the same pattern. Employees forgot his name. One woman once said, "Hey, you intern guy, print this." Another time, someone placed coffee cups on his desk without asking and walked away like it was his job to clean after them. And sometimes they laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Not sure how he even got in here, one man said during lunch. Probably diversity hire. Another replied. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on his keyboard, but he still said nothing. Because reacting would change nothing, but observing would. So he observed everything, every comment, every attitude, every decision, every bias hidden behind casual language, and every night when the office emptied, Ethan stayed late. Not working, watching, taking notes, analyzing behavior patterns, studying leadership culture. Because Harrington & Co. was not just a workplace, it was a test environment. And no one in the building knew it, except one person, the CEO, Richard Carter, Ethan's father, but even that connection was hidden. Not publicly, not even internally. Ethan was listed as a temporary intern placement through external academic program. A cover story, a controlled entry, a silent evaluation. On Friday, everything changed. A company-wide meeting was announced, mandatory attendance, executive floor conference room, no explanation given. That alone made people nervous, because in corporate environments like this, sudden meetings meant only one thing: change, layoffs, restructuring, or something worse. By 10 a.m., the conference room was full, executives in front rows, managers behind them, interns at the back. Ethan sat quietly in the corner, same as always. People chatted nervously. What do you think this is about? Probably budget cuts. I heard the new investors are strict. No one looked at Ethan. No one ever did. Then the doors opened. The room went silent. Not because of Ethan, but because of the man who walked in behind him. CEO Richard Carter, flanked by senior board members. But something was different. Richard didn't walk to the front. He stopped near Ethan and stood beside him. Whispers started immediately. Confusion spread. Richard looked at the room, then spoke. "Before we begin, I want you to meet someone." He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "This is Ethan Carter." Silence, then confusion, then disbelief. A woman in the front row leaned forward. "Carter." Richard nodded. "Yes." He looked around the room slowly. "My son, The word dropped like a stone, heavy. Pino. The room froze. Ethan didn't move. He already knew this moment was coming. Richard continued. Ethan has been working here under observation for the past several weeks. Murmurs spread instantly. Observation. That word changed everything. A man stood up slightly. Wait, so he's been watching us? Richard didn't answer immediately. He let the silence grow, then said, yes. Ethan finally spoke, for the first time in the entire company. Calm, controlled. I wasn't here to learn about business, he said. Pause. I was here to learn about you. That hit harder than anything else. No anger in his voice, no aggression, just truth. I wanted to understand how people behave when they believe they are above someone else. Eyes dropped across the room. People started remembering things, small things, words, laughs, dismissals. Ethan continued, I learned a lot. Silence. Some of you treated me like I didn't exist. A pause. Some of you treated me like I didn't matter. He looked up slightly. And some of you showed me exactly what this company becomes when no one is watching. Richard stepped forward slightly. This evaluation is complete. The room tensed. What you're about to hear next will decide the future of this organization. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving the floor to his father. Richard looked around. This company will not fail because of competition. A pause. It will fail if we allow the wrong culture to lead it. The room stayed frozen, effective immediately. Leadership restructuring will begin. Gasps, whispering, panic, based not only on performance, but behavior. Eyes widened, and every action taken in this building over the past weeks has been recorded. Complete silence, because now they understood nothing had been accidental. Every ignored greeting, every insult, every comment, everything was part of the evaluation. Richard looked directly at the room. You were not just working. Pause. You were being observed. Ethan's gaze swept across them one last time. Not revengeful, not emotional, just final. Because now they knew the truth. He was never the intern they thought he was. He was the reason the test existed at all. And they had already failed before they even realized they were being tested. The room stayed completely still after Richard's last words, as if even breathing too loudly would make the situation worse. The weight of what had just been revealed didn't land all at once. It sank in slowly, like a stone dropping into deep water, spreading tension in every direction. Ethan remained standing slightly behind his father, his expression unchanged, not because he felt nothing, but because he had already processed this moment long before it arrived. For him, this wasn't shock, it was confirmation. Richard stepped forward again, his presence filling the front of the conference room. This is not a performance review, he said firmly. This is a cultural audit, and what you've witnessed is only the beginning. A man in the second row finally spoke up, his voice uneasy. Sir, with all respect, we didn't know who he was. Richard looked at him directly. That's the point, he replied. The silence that followed was sharper this time, because there was no defense for that. Ethan slowly walked a few steps forward, now standing closer to the center. He looked around the room, his gaze steady but not aggressive. When people think someone has no power, he said quietly, that's when you see their real behavior. He paused. And that's exactly what I saw here. A woman near the back shifted uncomfortably. She looked down at her hands, remembering the times she had casually brushed past him without acknowledgement. Another man swallowed hard, suddenly recalling his own comments in the break room, jokes he thought were harmless at the time. But now, none of it felt harmless. Now it all felt documented. Ethan continued, I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here to understand what needs to change. Richard nodded slightly, approving the direction. But change only happens when truth is uncomfortable, Ethan added. A long pause followed. Then Richard gestured toward the screen behind him. It lit up instantly. Names appeared. Departments, notes, observations. Some entries were short, others detailed. Repeated dismissive behavior toward junior staff. Pattern of interrupting minority employees during meetings. Informal remarks reflecting bias in workplace language. The room reacted immediately. Whispers turned into panic. This is being recorded, someone asked under their breath. Yes, Richard answered calmly and reviewed. Ethan didn't look at the screen. He didn't need to. He already knew what was there, because he wrote most of it himself. Over weeks of observation, he had documented everything not with emotion, but with precision. Not to attack individuals, but to understand systems. Patterns mattered more than isolated incidents. And what he saw wasn't just individual bias, it was cultural normalization of disrespect. Richard turned slightly toward Ethan. "Do you want to continue?" he asked quietly. Ethan nodded once, then stepped forward again. "This company has talented people," he said. "That's not the issue." He scanned the room slowly. "The issue is that talent here is often filtered through perception before it's evaluated through capability." That line hit differently, because it was true. People didn't even realize how often they made decisions based on assumptions: who they trusted, who they ignored, who they listened to. Ethan continued, "I was called intern guy for 3 weeks before anyone bothered to learn my name. A few heads dropped lower. I was assigned work that had nothing to do with my role. Not because I wasn't capable, but because it was assumed I wouldn't be." Silence. "And I watched how people spoke when they thought I was not important enough to remember. That was the hardest part. Because it wasn't loud racism, it wasn't obvious hostility. It was casual disregard." Richard stepped in again. "This evaluation is not about punishment," he said. "It is about alignment." A few people looked up at that word. "Alignment with what?" someone asked nervously. "With standards," Richard replied simply. He turned slightly toward "This company will now operate under a revised structure. Leadership roles will be reassessed, teams will be reorganized where necessary, and every department will undergo mandatory behavioral review training." The room reacted again, this time not with confusion, but realization. This wasn't symbolic. This was real change. Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "You don't lose this opportunity because of one mistake," he said. "You lose it because of patterns you refuse to see." That line settled heavily, because everyone understood what it meant. This wasn't about a single incident. It was about accumulated behavior. Richard looked across the room one final time. "I built this company on performance," he said, "but I overlooked something equally important. A pause, character." The word carried weight, because performance can build success, but character determines what that success becomes. He turned slightly toward Ethan. "And I won't make that mistake again." Ethan stepped back slightly, signaling that he was done speaking for now. The room remained frozen, unsure whether to react, apologize, or simply wait. But there was no immediate resolution, only awareness, and consequences that would unfold over time. As Richard began to dismiss the meeting, people slowly started to stand. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations were minimal, almost non-existent. No one wanted to be the first to speak normally again. Ethan stayed seated for a moment longer. As the room emptied, a few employees passed him without eye contact. Others hesitated briefly, as if wanting to say something but not knowing what would make it right. One man who had once joked about him in the break room stopped near the door. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then quietly said, "I'm sorry." Ethan looked at him, a long pause, then nodded once. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. Because change didn't come from one moment. It came from what followed after. When the room was finally empty, Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder again. "You did what I asked?" he said quietly. Ethan looked up slightly. "I did what was necessary," he replied. Richard nodded. And for the first time, there was no CEO and intern. Just father and son, standing in the aftermath of a test the company would not forget anytime soon.